Thanks so much, everyone, and welcome back. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Erica Chenoweth is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment and Academic Dean for Faculty Development at Harvard Kennedy School, a Faculty Dean at Forsheimer House at Harvard College, and Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Chenoweth directs the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, where they studied political violence and its alternatives. They're particularly interested in how people effectively resist authoritarianism and push for systemic change, and in using social science tools and evidence to support movement-led political transformation. Their current book project, The End of People Power, explores the puzzling decline in the success of civil resistance movements in the past decade, even as the technique has become more popular worldwide. I was particularly thrilled when Erica accepted our invitation to speak here because this is exactly the kind of interdisciplinary, multifaceted conversations that I want the research program to be holding. I think this really brings a new strain into the conversation we're having on AI and democratic freedoms. So thank you for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to this very stimulating and important set of conversations. I want to give a few opening notes just to set the table in a way that I think dovetails really nicely with the last panel. So first of all, as you'll, before I get started, as you'll soon see, I know very little about AI. I'm a late bloomer. I have no tech background, and it's only because of my students, research assistants, and postdoc collaborators that I'm now engaged in this work at all. And so I just want to give credit to where it's due, including my colleague Jason Lien, who's here. What I do study is social movements. I study how social movements are propelled or destroyed. And that includes some angles that are related to technology, but isn't exclusive to them. And so what I want to do is talk about why, in spite of the common skepticism about the potential role of AI in people power movements in some corners today, I have become convinced that the stakes of our current political landscape are so high that we ought not entirely surrender the space of AI innovation to basically the tech sector and authoritarian governments themselves. This is, I'm sure, preaching to the converted, but I have some fairly specific ideas in mind. The third thing I'll say is that, as is my custom on the eve of an important talk, I contracted a nasty respiratory virus. I am not contagious. I sound worse than I feel at this point, but I do apologize for the grating nature of my voice. So, with all those things said, let me start by just reiterating something that was touched upon in the last panel about the current global democratic recession. So for those that are unfamiliar with the work of our colleague Grant's organization Freedom House, they have been tracking what many call the global democratic recession over the past 18 years and have found a year-over-year decline in democracy worldwide in every year over the past 18 years. This year, it's likely the case that the vast majority of the world's population is living under authoritarian forms of government. And this trend is both because of backsliding in established democracies, because of the deepening of authoritarianism in already autocratic regimes, and in serious autocratic challenges that are emerging in established and advanced democracies, the likes of which have not been seen in 100 years. So what's important to know is that in the past 100 years, the way out of democratic backsliding and of authoritarianism that had already consolidated was primarily through what you might call people power movements, movements that were making demands for democracy that resulted ultimately in major democratic breakthroughs on every continent. That includes, cases that might come to mind from the late 80s, like Poland and the Solidarity Movement, the People Power Movement in the Philippines, the democracy movement in Brazil, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and other major mass movements that expanded or brought democracy to a country. So what has been the fate of people power movements over the last few years? What we have seen is that if you look at this graph, this is data that I maintain at my lab, and what we've seen is that the success rates of, you could call these mass democracy movements or revolutionary movements that are trying to oust incumbent national regimes, usually dictators, or create independent territories out of colonized territories or through secession or self-determination. So these are what political scientists refer to as maximalist campaigns, because if they win, they're going to fundamentally reshape the nature of sovereignty and the state. So what this is showing is that those that were primarily nonviolent, those are people power movements where ordinary citizens are using protests, strikes, boycotts, stay away as go slows, other forms of non-cooperation to propel their movement, have succeeded really twice as often as their armed counterparts over the last 125 years. But that success advantage has been declining, and the absolute success rates of people power movements have been declining especially fast over the last 10 years. So I hasten to add that armed revolutionary movements are also becoming much less effective than they have been at any period in recorded history in the last 125 years. But the success rate of both has been declining at rates that we haven't seen in 100 years. So that suggests that there's something that's global and systemic that's happening to all kinds of mass mobilization, not just that peaceful protest isn't effective or something like that. It's that actually the opponents of these movements have become better at defeating them in general. And the news is kind of even worse than that. In new data that I'm soon going to publish with my colleague Suyuan Kang, we found that for reformist episodes of contention, these are those that wouldn't be those maximalist claims like democracy movements or whatever, but they'd be reform movements. These would include wage and labor campaigns. They would include environmental movements, racial justice movements, the expansion of civil rights, gender rights, et cetera. These movements have also been defeated at higher and higher rates year over the past couple of decades, and declining even in their ability to achieve significant concessions short of full success during that same period. Success rates are basically flat. That is outright success of them getting everything they say they want. And this is true even though people are using these techniques of people power at much greater rates than they have ever before. So that's the sort of puzzle that motivates the stakes that I'm laying out. So we do know from a lot of different literature the things that made people power movements so successful in the past in either reversing democratic backsliding or having major democratic breakthroughs in authoritarian regimes. And there are really four things that the literature focuses on. The first is the ability of mass movements to really attract a large and diverse, that is cross-cutting participation from throughout their society. So the movements that win are the ones that have people from all walks of life participating. They tend to cut across racial and ethnic cleavages, class cleavages, urban-rural divides, partisan divides, and things along those lines. But importantly, they also elicit the support of people in different pillars of support that would be otherwise upholding the authoritarian status quo. So, for example, the sort of key insight that emerges from the civil resistance literature is that there's no such thing as an authoritarian regime that is truly monopolistic in its power, that every autocrat has to rely totally on the cooperation, obedience, and help of people in different pillars of support, whether that's the military and security forces, police, economic and business elites, state media, civil servants, and others who have to continually go along with things as they are in order for the autocrat to maintain power. And so the key challenge for mass movements that are demanding a change and a change to expand democracy is to begin to pull away or dislocate those pillars of support from the autocrat in terms of their loyalty. So this looks like, you might know about the case of Serbia, where Slobodan Milosevic had been in power for a very long time and basically tried to steal an election in 2000. And there was a mass mobilization to prevent him from doing so. And at the key moment when the police were ordered to fire on unarmed demonstrators in the parliamentary square, the police pretended to not hear the order is what they did. So they just ignored it and pretended not to hear it. And activists knew that was happening because they had stolen walkie-talkies, heard the order come down, saw that it wasn't happening, and realized that they had won, and sort of declared victory. And Milosevic fled the square and resigned to spend more time with his grandson. Was later arrested and died in custody while awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. So basically, the upshot of all of this is that if movements are able to basically apply pressure in a way that begins to pull apart the loyalty of the autocrat in key pillars of support, that's when it creates these kind of crisis moments for the autocrat that create opportunities for pro-democracy forces to seize. And this is basically how Pinochet's regime, fell. This is how the apartheid regime fell in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So, the third thing that successful movements do is that when there are moments of repression against unarmed demonstrators, that they are able to make that repression backfire. This often happens because as the public witnesses levels of brutality against people that obviously don't deserve it, it does begin to shift public sentiment and begin to tear apart the autocrats' call for legitimacy. And then the fourth thing that successful movements do is they don't over-rely on any particular tactic like mass demonstrations, but they begin to maneuver and sequence tactics in ways that build pressure on their opponents while minimizing exposure to risk. So, for example, instead of just doing protests every day, day after day, in a way that becomes very predictable and perhaps even symbolic, they begin to show capacities for non-cooperation. Like instead of going to the streets, they withdraw and stay at home for 3 days, which, as we all learned during COVID, can literally shut down an economy in ways that create immediate material impacts. So, what I would argue is that these four pillars are known not just to movements, but now to autocrats. And what's going on is that there's been an unusually high level of coordination and uniformity in the ways that governments have adapted to the threat of people power movements, as well as active collaboration in defeating them, what you might call a new autocratic alliance. And that new autocratic alliance has adapted 4 different strategies to undermine the 4 ways that movements win. The first is by making sure that nobody defects. The second is by dominating the information ecosystem and winning the information war. The third is by using selective repression in ways that make it very difficult for movements to exploit moments of intense brutality. And the fourth is perfecting the art of divide and rule. So let me talk about what each of those looks like briefly. There's evidence from around the world that there's been a high level of learning that the main way that people power movements win is when your military, your police, your economic elites don't support you. And so what they do is they engage in political education during trainings of police, during trainings of the military to say, protesters are going to try to put a carnation in the end of your gun barrel, and those people are actually backed by our foreign enemies, and they're conspirators, and they are here to make sure that you betray your country, and you should never do that. That's the number one thing never to do. And so this is now baked into political education that occurs in the process of training of security forces. Preemptive payouts and payments to basically buy off one's inner entourage are very common. Fragmenting the security apparatus so that if one part of the security forces defect, not all of them will defect, is another key strategy that we're seeing around the world. The fourth is the delegation of repression to people who are in plain clothes or who don't look obviously like they can be assigned to any particular security force institution. The fifth is purges of obvious or suspected disloyalists. And the sixth is direct repression of disloyalists. So in other words, jailing them or in some cases, charging them with treason and even executing them. These techniques together have made it more difficult for movements to elicit the defection of security forces. And we've seen that as an increasing trend over time. The second key adaptation has been around winning the information war, and part of this has been around dominating information ecosystems by, of course, purchasing news outlets or crushing those that don't align more directly with the state through lawfare and sometimes through criminal proceedings. Using surveillance and intelligence collection, particularly now assisted by AI tools, as others have mentioned in previous panels, is a vast part of the toolkit that's expanding, both in its scope and its sophistication. Flooding the zone with rumors, disinformation, and propaganda, some of which might be created by and tested by different AI tools, is part of the toolkit. And then also shutting down the internet at times when it's convenient to do so, and then turning it on when it's convenient to do so is part of it. So in Myanmar, you might recall the civil resistance or civil disobedience movement that rose up against the coup there. One of the techniques that was sort of imported from another authoritarian regime was being able to shut off Facebook and the internet, really, so that people can use Facebook to organize against the regime. But then when the regime would do something truly awful to an activist, they would open it again so that people could share the horrific news about a torturous method of execution and then shut it off again long enough, so that people could get the bad news and be terrorized, but not organize a response. Selective repression is the third part of the toolkit. It is minimizing the exposure to threats to your legitimacy by not cracking down on everyone, but instead using particular individuals that the regime assumes are easy to mischaracterize, and characterizing them with the most kind of egregious crimes like terrorism, treason, or plotting coups. Avoiding public shows of brutality, but using that selective terror to make examples of people, and jailing rather than murdering others. Lawfare is another key administrative tool that is being used, as was mentioned also during the previous panel. And then the fourth set of key strategies is perfecting the art of divide and rule. And this is really just fomenting greater social divisions in a way that provides an equilibrium that's easy to control. So encouraging loyalist and pro-autocratic mobilization, reinforcing or even inducing divisions within movements, usually along identity lines or whatever the sort of relevant cleavage is in the society at a given moment, infiltrating movements in a way that provokes them to be indisciplined in the way that they conduct their strategy and tactics, stoking identity-based conflicts more generally outside of a movement so that the movement is viewed in a certain light by the public. And then, of course, isolating, dividing, and scapegoating minority groups within the country in a way that make it more challenging to establish clear channels of solidarity. So this is like formidable terrain in what's going on. And I think technology and technological innovation has played a role. It has played a role in all of the dimensions of adaptation that are being used to make mass movements less effective. And I think the primary domain in which AI tools particularly are being used is in the latter three. So I go to pains to describe this landscape just to underscore the fact that this is very formidable terrain, that democracy movements around the world have really been struggling to operate effectively and to adapt to this autocratic playbook, especially because there's such large-scale collaboration between regimes. And so my argument would basically be that we need an upgraded playbook to deal with these adaptations and also to innovate in new ways. So there are lots of different elements to this playbook that derive specifically from the different ways that we know that mass movements succeed. And for our purposes, I think the fourth here, exploiting novel technologies, is the most relevant. So enter my wonderful research assistants and colleagues who convinced me of the possibilities of AI. So the way this went down is that a couple of years ago, a bunch of us were sitting around in my lab and we were talking about this decline in the effectiveness of movements and whether or not technology had something to do with it. And for about the 150th time, one of my students said, "What do you think about AI and movements?" And I sort of said, "I don't think anything about AI and movements. I just have no idea how to wrap my mind around it." And one of the other people said, "Well, we can just why don't we try to think about as a group, think about a little bit more about it." And I sort of joked. I said, "Well, why don't you open up ChatGPT and put in there, how can AI support democracy movements? Ha ha ha." And so the research assistant did do that, and ChatGPT produced a very long thesis with some very clear examples of ways that AI could support movements, and it got us talking as a group. Since then, we actually organized a workshop last December with activists from around the world who have been in some of these extremely beleaguered movements, with scholars who study the intersection between technology, social movements, and repression, and with some people from the tech space who have been trying to innovate new applications of AI to support democracy and democracy movements. And, we tested out some of these ideas. And so what I want to say here is that when we're talking about exploiting novel technologies, the main thing that comes through here is just that if movements don't think systematically about how to appropriate any technology that is floating around in their universe, that becomes a major vulnerability for them, right? So especially when there's an arms race of the kind that we're now seeing around AI. And so all movements tend to ultimately appropriate and sometimes even quite innovatively use emerging technologies or disruptive technologies to their advantage. Certainly we saw this in the heady days of the arrival of the internet, when it did seem the case that movements were some of the more innovative spaces in which the internet was being used to organize and mobilize. But there's been much more caution and skepticism across many movements in doing this with AI for all of the reasons that folks have been mentioning. But if you think about some of the challenges that movements are having, particularly in this new kind of autocratic alliance era, one of the major issues that they have is actually just getting a sense of what their operational landscape is. So who is connected to who? Where are the financial interests? Who is on their side? Who is not on their side? Can you map the pillars of analysis that would be relevant to the autocrat's support? Can you identify or predict where there might be vulnerabilities? All of these things become increasingly challenging for people to do themselves without exposing themselves to major risks. And if there are ways that technologies can be useful, at least in providing alternative scenarios that can get people thinking creatively about how to approach and sequence tactics around their current environment, this could be a huge benefit to a lot of movements. Communication and outreach is another area where a lot of movements invest a lot of person hours. And I was talking with somebody before this that if movements could be freed from that type of time because there was something that was helping them generate content so that they could be thinking about these big strategic questions that need attention, that would probably not be a bad thing. I think a lot of people would be relieved that they didn't have to spend as much time on things that could be assisted with the tool. Sentiment analysis, oppositional research analysis, which I've already discussed, and the ability to monitor anomalies that might indicate an operational security threat to a movement would be very helpful for most movements. This is not something that most of them have the capability for, but really need it. Being able to allocate resources in a much more efficient way, particularly when it comes to tactical sequencing, would be an area in which we can imagine AI-assisted tools making an impact. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of movements eventually try to do is they try to figure out whether their strategy in running a particular campaign is going to be effective or not. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do that. One is by red teaming it with a bunch of people who know things about the current environment. Another one is just to go out and try and see what happens. Both of those become increasingly risky in the current terrain. And so if there are ways to create coaches that can tutor movements in ways that are safer or don't expose them to as much risk, that could also be a very worthy set of experiments. Legal assistance is something that is on huge demand, and this could be anything from trying to connect people with legal resources when they're under attack, to helping to design or write briefs, or documentation, petitions, things that actually put in the public record abuses that are happening. And it's really important to underscore how important it is for there to be the documentation of abuses put into the public record, which is often what legal briefs can do, because without that, it's very difficult sometimes to do accountability down the road. Organizing rapid response to threats to personnel or assets can be a very important application. Even just networking, figuring out who else is in one's civil society space that might be aligned or might be able to join in some kind of campaign is something that's beyond the capacity of many movements when they are under attack. And then finally, as I mentioned, just even doing things like strategic and tactical coaching, getting a sense of where the vulnerabilities are in a particular plan, who it's likely to affect, who it's unlikely to affect, could be very important. One of our team members was pointing out a very impressive application. I'm not sure if it has come up yet at this conference or not, but in 2018, during the Russian municipal elections, there was a group that developed an algorithm to study the CCTV web footage of every polling station in Russia, which is like maybe millions of hours of footage. And they came up with an algorithm that was able to detect irregularities in human interactions with the ballot box. So for example, there's a certain set of movements that people do when they're trying to put a ballot in the ballot box. And it taught the algorithm how to detect that. And then it taught the algorithm to point out if there were irregularities, like if people weren't just doing this in the ballot box. And so then they showed video of times when humans were going like this to the ballot box. And so then they zoomed in on those videos and they were able to identify hundreds of instances where ballots were just shoved into the ballot box that were pre-marked. And you can see those videos on the footage. So like these are examples of applications that would be very difficult for humans to do because of the millions of hours of footage, but that there are natural applications for movements. The last thing I'll say is just aggregating information about how people can be involved in a movement is crucial in times of democratic backsliding. So you might be familiar with the ByCat app or the Boycott app or the No Thanks app. These are all applications that have aggregated information about campaigns to encourage consumer boycotts of particular products or companies. The examples like that make it just more accessible for people to participate in a movement without giving any sign really that they're doing so. One of the kind of really big issues that arises here is the lack of coordination and lesson sharing across different movements from around the world. And some of that's deliberate. It can be very difficult to collaborate, especially when there are language barriers and other things. By the way, that's another potential application for AI-assisted tools, is just better translation and interpretation. But I think that there are three things that are already underway that can really be built upon effectively to deal with the problems of the current authoritarian alliance. The first is more training and strategy convenings that explicitly address some of the key vulnerabilities that exist in the current terrain. There are groups that have started to develop tech-specific tools like Canvas, which has a sort of initiative called AI Intelligence. There's the Social Movement Technologies group that has been doing activist trainings on AI applications and things like that. And there are other groups that are kind of working on trying to figure out how this could be made the most effective. Certainly developing and sustaining a global network of pro-democracy movements and supporters that include tech supporters, I think is pretty urgent at this time. And then trying to figure out more effective ways to build in feedback loops of knowledge to practice and vice versa would be very helpful. For example, developing an infrastructure to where we can assess whether AI-assisted tools are actually helping or making things more difficult for movements is an urgent task. So a few other things to mention that certainly came up at the workshop and are on my mind as puzzles that I know all of you have undoubtedly thought through. So the first is the issue about sharing sensitive data, particularly things like movement plans or strategies, into applications or platforms where there's no commitment to human rights on the back end. So there needs to be the development of independent and ethically aligned platforms that people can actually test, like in a sandbox, some of their ideas without it falling into the literal opposite hands of who they would want it to fall into. That can take some computational power, as you know, and so is something that wouldn't necessarily be as accessible to everyone around the world as others, but seems to be a very important first step. The second big caveat is one that is a bit more troubling for me, which is that if we were going to train a bunch of different coaching or strategic tools on the existing corpus of substantive material about how civil resistance works for democracy movements, we'd be training it on largely data from the past 125 years, where we've already been seeing a decline in the effectiveness of these movements, and we have no idea if the world in which we are now in and entering into is going to contain the same lessons as what we saw over the past 125 years. Now, I don't know what that means about what we should be training this stuff on, but I think that we need to be cautious about assuming that what worked 60 years ago is what will work today, particularly with the United States being in the state that it's in. The third big caveat is that people power is still always going to be people power, and obviously we can't substitute for the value of the deliberative kind of messy processes that are the stuff of democracy and that are what unleash the creativity of movements when they do gain the upper hand. But we do want to think about ways in which we can preserve some of the precious time that activists and organizers and leaders of these movements need to do the difficult work of deliberation and democracy. And in that sense, I think AI-assisted tools could be quite useful. And I think the most important task here is trying to figure out if there exists some kind of ethical code of conduct for how people use these tools. If it does, please tell me what it is and who did it. If it doesn't exist, let's please make it so that we can align on some core guardrails about how to use these things for good. I hope to enlist those who are much more knowledgeable than I am, which is to say probably all of you, in the sort of project of supporting movements that are committed to basic rights, rule of law, checks and balances, and pursuing the sort of emancipatory and egalitarian values and institutions that have allowed so many to prosper over the last century. And as imperfect as our democratic project has been, we will sure be sorry when it's over. And so I do hope that we will find ways to address the new autocratic alliance in ways that will bring about the fourth wave of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. I'm sure the audience has questions as well, so you can submit those through the QR code, or you can come up to the mics. I'll try to get through as many people as I can in about 20 minutes that we have. But I wanted to start off because you issued a call to action, and I think a lot of people would probably like to take you up on it. So if there are people who do want to try to assist in building these tools or helping these movements, where do they start?
That's a great question. I think there are two ways to answer it. The first is definitely send me an email because I'm trying to build a consortium together with colleagues like Jason here at the Kennedy School who are really interested in working on this, and we are going to have some convenings and some both research and kind of research to practice sessions around that. So please, be in touch. And I think the second way to think about it is that in every case where we have seen major democratic breakthroughs in the past in particular countries, what we have seen is something like an umbrella kind of formation of a united democratic alliance. And that doesn't mean that people need to move away from what it is they're doing. They should do more of what they're doing and do it in alignment with others. So I think the biggest mistake that could be made in countries that are backsliding right now is to sort of not get whatever autonomous civil society continues to exist to get information together, and come to some core kind of commitments and agreements about what they might do to promote and improve democracy. So that's more of a meta thing, which is to say people don't need to stop doing what they're doing. They should continue doing what they're doing and just try to do it with others. I think that's the main takeaway.
Great. I will be writing to you about that consortium. Okay, so I also wanted to ask about something that you mentioned in the talk, the domination of the information environment, and what I also worry about, the fragmentation of the information environment. So one of the things I've been struggling with what the United States is going through is just not understanding how many other people are seeing what you are seeing and processing it the way you're processing it. And I wonder, how have resistance movements tried to deal with those challenges? What sorts of communication strategies tend to work best in that environment?
Yeah, so I can speak to some of the, longer term or older movements here. So we used to call misinformation propaganda. and a lot of different movements that I've studied were able to break through in spite of overwhelming information dominance of their opponents, right? So that were pushing propaganda that completely they owned every aspect of sort of independent media, et cetera. And what those movements did is interesting. So if you think about like the Solidarity movement in Poland, this is a movement that is named after its own newspaper, which was banned. And banning it made it popular. It made it really popular. Like tens of millions of people got it eventually because it was banned and it was the only alternative source of information in town. And so building some kind of alternative media that is irresistible, in part just because it's different, it's like novel, refreshing, and it's not the state trying to crush your brain with its with its lies, is a very attractive thing. So the issue with that is that a lot of different autocrats in today's environment kind of caught on to that, and they don't do propaganda the same way anymore. They do flood the zone. Right? Mm-hmm. So they trash the information environment. And then people aren't going to be attracted to some irresistible single source of alternative information because they don't know how to adjudicate it and they're just going to check out. So trash the zone makes people disengage. So the task for movements is to figure out two things. One, how to get people to re-engage, which just means meeting them where they're at. Like maybe it's radio, maybe, and the second is provide some irresistible content. And that's a culture question. That's not even a strategy question. It's just trying to figure out what is the sort of attractive, irresistible content that is going to pull people in. And that's going to require some experimenting.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask about the relationship between protest and protest participation and then longer term movement building. And, we are just a few days after a large nationwide protest on April 5th. And I'm just wondering, like, how do movements try to take people from protest participants into sort of the broader movement, getting them engaged in broader things? How does technology help with that? And what role does technology play in people being aware that these protests are happening and their ability to participate?
Yeah, so protests can be very useful in a couple of ways. The first is just to do a show of numbers, right? Like the April 5th protest was meant to just show that there were a lot of people here who are opposing what was going on. And the second is that it can draw in people who don't otherwise know how to get into a movement. So it literally puts people out in public spaces where others can come in. Beyond that, sometimes protests can be surprisingly large, and that can start to activate in people's minds that the situation is not as immutable as what the autocrat wants them to believe. And this is particularly true in already autocratic regimes where very large protests can shatter the sense of immutability of the situation. In democracies, less so, but in backsliding democracies, it can be very important. Now, the role of technology in getting people involved in both protests and longer movement action is that, over the last 15 years or so, 20 years, we have seen movements that are relying more on social media as the primary mechanism for communicating and coordinating how people can participate. Some have argued that that's actually weakened the signal of protest because it shows that it's lower cost and lower risk. And so people are less impressed if a lot of people turn out. It just looks like people blowing off steam, and it was easy to do that. Others have argued that, scale is important, and if you can seize on the numbers and build momentum, that actually that was a helpful investment to use the social media to do that. I think that the difficulty comes in the surveillance environment, where in a lot of autocratic regimes over the last 15 years, we have seen, the primary device as being one of identifying who the troublemakers are and crushing them. So that's coming, to other countries that it hasn't happened in yet, or other constituencies within countries who haven't experienced that yet. And so it's very important, just as in any kind of strategic campaign, to have backup plans and other modes of communication, nerve centers, in ways of getting the message out that don't rely on such overt forms of public communication.
Are there strategies that have developed in those countries where that kind of surveillance has been in place that activists have adopted to try to evade some of that or mitigate it that might apply in other contexts?
Yeah, I mean, in Hong Kong, for example, the umbrella movement was in part the umbrella movement because they would use umbrellas to, conceal their identities. There was a lot of masking in that movement. And things along those lines. So it's sort of a tactical adaptation question of whether movements are able to sort of stay one step ahead or know what they're going to do when a particular adaptation becomes no longer relevant. Mm-hmm. So in Hong Kong, for example, it was one of the places where they banned the wearing of masks during protests early because they knew that was part of what they were doing to conceal identity.
Okay, I'm going to take some of the questions coming in on the QR code. There's a never AI strain of thinking, particularly on the left, that suggests any use of generative, or I'm going to say advanced AI, is essentially anti-democratic and a betrayal of progressive values. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I understand where it's coming from, and I also think that most movements around the world are going to find themselves interacting with it no matter what, in part because it's already becoming so integrated into other types of technologies that people take for granted that it's going to be unavoidable. It's just going to be part of every aspect of life, and because of that, I think that there are sort of two ways to respond. One is to try to gain advantage to the extent possible in ethical ways from the existing kind of platforms and tools so that, movements can actually be effective in fighting for the types of regulations that they think are appropriate at all. And the second way is to actually develop alternative, tools, uses, technologies that actually do comport to more progressive or kind of liberal norms. Both of these things are possible. There are trade-offs. But I think that if movements are in the never AI space, not only is that going to be impossible, but I think they might be cutting off some important avenues for helping themselves in the short term.
Thank you. So how can or how have individual people and entities overcome the collective action dilemma that comes with resisting authoritarianism in a political environment that targets dissent?
Yeah, well, most movements, that I've studied have been in political environments where dissent was completely banned or outlawed, and had to find ways to overcome serious constraints on collective action regardless. I think that part of this is, as I mentioned, doing as much as possible to build some kind of umbrella that has a very low barrier to entry in terms of what the core commitments are, and that allow civil society to move together in certain moments where moving together would be very important. It doesn't mean they have to do it all the time, but need to be prepared to do so in times of emergency. The second piece is just in terms of like the different interest calculations, whatever, of different parts of civil society. Part of this stems from the lack of a shared analysis about our common peril, right? So some people think that that they are living in an environment that's kind of politics as normal, but with some extremes, and that the pendulum will swing back. And other people think politics as normal is not the situation that we're in. We're in an emergency. And that's why we're seeing the collective action problem. If everybody realized that we're in an emergency, we would see less of a collective action problem. And so part of it is just convincing people that we're in World 2, not World 1.
Great. Okay, let's do this. There's a couple questions at the microphone. How about everybody asks their question concisely, please, and then Erica can try to respond as best they can. Go first.
Okay, thank you. Do you see, so you talked about how the things that have worked are working less and less well, and I'm just curious if you see any glimmers of places where people seem to be using a new playbook that seems to be working better, and could AI be a way in which we could accelerate our learning process collectively? And kind of building on that, like right now it seems like the other side, the authoritarian side, has a lot of advantages in the development, use, and deployment of tools. The big platforms are on their side, like completely. So I just keep trying to think of, is there some way that we can have an inherent advantage in the deployment or development of some aspect of these technologies that is like structural or just built into what we're about, so that we're not just playing catch up, because it feels like we're never going to just catch up. But how do we lean into what is unique about pro-democracy organizing and mate that with this technology in some way that gives us an advantage?
Yeah. So, on your first question about, do I see glimmers of hope? I always see glimmers of hope because I'm fundamentally oriented in that direction, and I'm looking for things that are breaking through. I think that one of the lessons that is still true from historical cases is that really non-cooperation is what gets the goods. Protest and persuasion are very important. Building alternative institutions is very important. Non-cooperation, that is when people just like stop saying yes and start saying no en masse, is the thing that usually tips the political balance of power. And we have been seeing that. We've been seeing people trying to exercise that muscle. For example, like, sellbacks of Teslas and people not buying from certain stores or not buying certain products because they think it is, inconsistent with their values. People talking about not going to work and things like that. This is, non-cooperation is, the general strike, for example, is like the most powerful tool that humans have ever figured out how to use to change the balance of power in a short moment. And so, these types of things are bubbling up in different places, and I think show that people recognize the need for kind of a more muscular approach to changing material interests. On the, what are the sort of short-term applications? I think that there are lots of things that even in the classroom we've learned can be enhanced by using AI tools to do things that are actually just socially difficult to do in the classroom, like discuss taboo subjects and learn how to talk about it better, like actually learn how to be a more receptive listener. One of my colleagues at the Kennedy School developed a tool that helps people learn how to engage with controversial ideas in a way that makes them easier to talk to and more of a bridge builder. So if we can do that, and we've tested that those things actually do better in a tool that's like a tutor and a coach that somebody can engage privately, I'm sure that there are lots of different things that people can learn about and for movements that they'd rather learn in an environment like that than in front of everybody in a big room where they're worried about the sort of social stigma. So that's just stuff we already know that could have applications there.
Great. Can you ask yours very quickly? And then Ranjit, if you want to ask yours as well, and then we'll close out.
Thank you. Very quickly, in your people power classification, did you take account of successful movements where people had terrible buyer's remorse, like the Soviet Union or Iran or the Shah of Iran, or like what we now have, since we're the campus university, since we're at Columbia campus, pro-Palestinian movements where both PA and Hamas are just thugdoms, and yet people are yelling for them to, hoping that they win. And the second question is, you've mentioned lawfare as one of the tactics, and it only works because judging is essentially arbitrary, at least in federal courts. So can you comment on the absence of study, which I find stunning, about how judges actually decide cases? Somehow this is not being
thank you.
studied. Thank you.
Ranjit, can you also ask yours, please?
Yes, a fairly simple question, I guess so. Can you speak a little bit to the emotional landscape of social movements and how it is changing in the current moment, given that outrage is clearly not, a weapon that it used to be earlier, and now it's kind of, what are the ways in which we can emotionally express ourselves as we gather together to think about social movements?
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So there's a big literature on the sort of fate of countries after people power movements have succeeded or failed. And the big takeaways from that literature are, first of all, that when movements are nonviolent, which is to say that they're not harming other people directly, and when they are inclusive of a very broad kind of sector of society, again, all walks of life, that they are more likely to result in democratic outcomes. That's for the maximalist campaigns that I studied, so the sort of revolutionary campaigns. So there are lots of cases where, movements might have been like tolerant of an armed wing, which was the case in, the sort of Russian Revolution, as was mentioned. And then there's also cases where there was sort of a breakthrough revolutionary moment, like with the initial kind of Russian Revolution, and then there was a kind of a seizure of power later on that was with like radical violent actors that really sealed the fate of the Soviet Union as a more dictatorial regime, when the more pro-democratic types and the sort of pacifists and nonviolent actors were purged or executed or driven out. So this is always a risk with mass movements, but we know from the last 100 years of data that when movements are disciplined in their tactics, when they're inclusive and when they carry through with putting pressure on those in power to continue democratic reforms, that they are more likely to end up more democratic. It's very important who's at the negotiating table, though. On the second question about judges in the judicial system, in my field in political science, there's actually a decent amount of literature about what motivates judicial decisions. My colleague Maya Sen is kind of a key thinker on this. And there's an emerging literature that suggests that things like people's familial relationships, for example, if they have daughters, are they more likely to, rule in ways that are more respective of women's rights and reproductive rights and things along those lines? The answer is yes. And so there is some research that's emerging. I don't think that research, though, would classify such decisions as arbitrary. I think they would simply say that that there are, potentially some predictive factors of whether certain judges might be more receptive to different types of legal theories than others. But in terms of the overall application of the law, I'm not sure that there's any evidence to suggest that this, sways it one way or the other. And then on the third question about emotions, there's an interesting book by a guy named James Jasper called The Emotions of Protest. And what he says is that what's needed is the sort of combination of outrage and hope. If people are just angry but they're feeling resigned, there's not really a lot that goes on. If people are feeling afraid and resigned, that's the worst combination. What people need is to be outraged or upset, and they need to be hopeful. That is, they need to be able to imagine how their own agency and the agency of others around them might be able to impact the situation. And I find that very compelling, just having looked at moments in which things really seem to turn the tide in movements in the past, where it's clear that people kind of have this collective emotional experience of understanding what the sociologist Doug McAdam calls cognitive liberation, which is they have to do something. If they don't do something, nothing is going to change. And now that they know this, there's no going back. They can't forget it.
This was excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you all for the great questions.